Well, it's great to be here. I was here a few years ago, and I really enjoyed presenting. When we were talking about what the topic for today would be, obviously we're going to talk about why growing up is so hard. It looks like you were already getting into that before we started. But I was thinking about my practice. I've been a psychologist for 17 years now. And a large portion of what I do is I work with adolescents, young adults, and parents. And I was reflecting on how my work with kids has changed. And it was interesting. I think kids are pretty much the same as they were 17 years ago. And I think the challenges kids face are pretty much the same. They're trying to figure out who they are and get through adolescence and launch themselves into young adulthood. But obviously what has changed is a lot of other contextual factors. Technology, the cultural landscape, the social landscape. And what I've noticed in my work because of that, I think kids have a lot more problems today than they did when I first started my practice 17 years ago. And the way that I work with kids is very, very different. And I'm going to talk about basically two major issues I see, because I feel like as technology and all these other variables are kind of surging forward, kids and their maturity is kind of lagging behind. And there's two particular kinds of factors that I think are going on that I realize as I work as a psychologist, I'm spending more and more time working on this with kids than I did 17 years ago. The one major factor is emotions. I'll talk a lot about emotions in this presentation, and essentially what I'm going to talk about is how the bandwidth for the emotional experiences kids can tolerate is shrinking. It's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and if kids don't have a positive experience in a very narrow bandwidth, they really have issues, and this leads to substance abuse and all sorts of other problems. The other issue is relationships. I'm going to talk about issues with emotional IQ, not being able to read nonverbal cues, all sorts of issues I see in kids now that as a psychologist I find myself working with more and more and more and harder than I did 17 years ago. So that's where we'll start. And let me just give you a sense of, I thought it might be good to just kind of index the kind of calls I get to my practice, okay? Because you'd be surprised, and this has definitely changed from 17 years ago. One common call I get, it's really remarkable. Every Monday morning I get a couple calls from parents, and this is the phone call. The phone call is, my kid is afraid to drive. My kid has a driving phobia, okay? So they're kids who should be taking their lessons at school to get their learner's permit. And it's turning out more and more kids are actually afraid to drive. And this is linked to other rites of passage that kids are kind of balking on. I don't know how you were, but when I was like 11, I would sit in my father's car and dream of when I could drive my own car. That's changing. It's really, really surprising. You were alluding to this in the meeting before. The achievement demands on kids these days are incredible. I do some Harvard alumni interviewing, and every year I see kids who literally they could run countries, and they're not getting into Harvard. I know I couldn't get into Harvard now, and the stress The boarding school movement is profoundly impacting kids. The other issue too, which somebody was talking about earlier, was there's also this other trend with kids where suddenly even good kids who are achievement oriented suddenly drop off. They don't hand in assignments, they stop doing activities, and this often leads to another big trend, which is parents becoming overly invested in their kids' success, in their kids' achievement. There's one case I had in my practice where a boy, he was a senior, he started to write his college application personal essay, and he was submitting it to his college counselor, and he was very concerned the essay was not good enough, it was not strong enough. And he was basically writing about his experience at soccer, in his soccer team. He was feeling very anxious about this and would come back with comments from the counselor that were kind of critical, and he would be very upset and distressed. His mother started to get involved with the feedback, and you might anticipate where this is going. She started to rewrite some sections, and he went and played video games. And fast forward to February, he was in some interviews for some UC schools. And in one of the interviews, the interviewer pulled out a file and said, it was a really interesting essay to hear about your trip to Egypt. And this boy said, I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong application. I think you should check. So he said, your name is Joe Smith. And he said, yes. And his mother had made up and fictionalized the college application essay. That's not the first time I've had that in my practice. Okay? So there's all these trends going on, and then I have a whole other group of kids that I see, and maybe you encounter them, or maybe they're your own kids, where their kind of mantra is coasting. And I talk to these kids a lot, week after week. We meet in my office, and I talk to them, and they say, I don't want to expel energy. It's kind of like, if I expel too much energy, my batteries will go out. And it's very interesting. One of the kids talked with me about his senior project in high school, and he kind of didn't do it all that well, and his teachers gave him some very critical feedback, and he said to me, I am not that project. So he was sort of segregating himself from his work, which is a whole other trend.
Are you going to tell us how to do that?
I am. Yeah. I'm going to go through all the problems first and make you cry, and then give you hope. Yes. 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 Yeah. I'll give you some hope at the end. The other major factor going on, the major trend is, of course, substance abuse. Substance abuse among adolescents and young adults, the research shows it's at an all-time high. And it's not only social use, but the level of addiction is becoming higher and higher and higher. And it's not just marijuana and things like that. It's also the process addictions. So gaming, child pornography is on the rise. Kids looking at pornography, and gaming. Gaming is very predominant now. Despite all the technology, too, despite texting and Facebook and all that, the research also shows more kids these days are feeling socially isolated. You know about all the stories about bullying, but there's a sort of an insidious sense of social isolation among kids these days. There's also a movement, I don't know about the kids you've experienced here or your own kids, but I see a lot of kids who do not want to go to a four-year college. They think it's foolish. And they want to do college online. There's now, in researching this, there's now a 50 best online college book. It used to be like the 50 best colleges. Now there's the 50 best online colleges. And a lot of kids I talk to are, they're not invested in having a career, like in the normal model of going to college, then to sort of a professional school, and then starting a career. They're kind of like, I can start a business with a bunch of my friends. I can live, in Orange County and be close to the beach. And if I need to, I can take courses online. And that's kind of an emerging demographic of kids. Fun stuff so far? Okay. Now, if I haven't made you frightened, this will make you frightened. Okay. The other broader trends that are happening, this is kind of scientific research. It looks like, compared to several generations ago, kids these days are basically performing more weak than kids several generations ago on kind of all different variables they test, cognitive variables, emotional variables. It looks like kids today, despite technology, despite sort of the advancement of our society, they're doing poorer and poorer on essential variables of cognitive and emotional functioning. This is shocking, I think. If you haven't, you should look at the CNN study of social media and texting content that CNN did in collaboration with a bunch of scientists. It's called Being 13, Inside the Secret World of Teens. There's several YouTube videos about it, and you can watch different segments of this online. What's fascinating about this, despite the rather disturbing content of social media, the researchers, it's kind of not all that surprising, the researchers did find that kids are obsessed with their phones, okay? And the phone, some theorists view the phone as a second umbilical cord. So what they're saying is, there was the first umbilical cord, the first sort of separation from mother, and they're kind of moving through adolescence, and there's such anxiety and fear about becoming autonomous and independent that texting and Facebook almost serves as another umbilical cord, which is really fascinating. And in this study, there's one segment where they videotaped a 13-year-old girl. The scientists took away her cell phone for about 20 minutes, and she had a panic attack and went down on the kitchen floor in the fetal position, which they were, rather surprised of, but this is where we are. Now, you've heard of millennials, okay? So I've tried to outline the different generations here. And obviously this is, this is becoming an issue in the workplace, because in the workplace, of course, there's people from many different levels of these generations trying to interact, which is challenging. But the other issue I want to draw your attention to is the millennials. Now, the millennials are known as the boomerang generation. Do you know why? Right. Because it looks like they start to separate and split off from the family of origin and start to become autonomous and independent, and then they swing back around. Okay? Now, there's a lot of discussion about why this is the case. Okay? So some people believe we can't really blame our kids. It's also the fact that we're in a rather strange time societally. It's it's pragmatically, if you think about it, a child might graduate from a college, he might be doing very well, get a job in New York, the starting salary is $30,000, and a studio apartment to rent in Manhattan is $9,000 a month. So the math doesn't make sense, okay? So it's also, the research shows kids now may not do as well financially as their parents, several generations above them. So that's also another issue. What's that? I know. I'm just saying this because this will be, I'm trying to point out that what's going on is the separation, individuation process is becoming more and more blurry in our culture. And I'll say more about that. The research is showing, too, that the human life cycle appears to be changing. Okay? So here's what I mean. Previously, childhood was viewed as 0 to 11 or 12, and adolescence was 13 to 19. Okay? Now, sociologists and other social commentators are thinking that is no longer the case. Look at what they're saying. There's a childhood 0 to 11 or 12. And then they're dividing up adolescence. Now adolescence is it's being divided into two parts. There's a biological adolescence and then a psychological adolescence. So the biological adolescence is 13 to 20, psychological 21 to 26. Okay? This is also, they link this to findings where puberty is actually in North America getting earlier and earlier and earlier, with psychological maturity occurring later and later and later. So there's a great divide between biological maturity and psychological maturity. Okay? Previously, young adulthood was 20 to 25. Now, they're dividing that into two parts, emerging adulthood and then young adulthood. So a 40-year-old today is technically a young adult. You see the developmental timeline is getting extended out, stretched out, okay? Previously, adulthood was 26 to 64. Now, adulthood is 41 to 72 or 73. So I have these two pictures. These are kind of comparable men, okay? Previously, retirement was 64-ish. Now, retirement, of course, it's later and people are working right up until the end, okay? Now, this is related to the most kind of dramatic demonstration of this, which is what I call the vampire child. Okay, now when I presented this in other audiences, they said they were frightened. They thought I really meant vampire children. I really don't mean they're vampires. Here's what I mean. These are, people like boomerang kids or other people who are 25, 26, into their 30s. They're living at their parents' house. Okay? And in the morning, who's waking up? Mom and dad are waking up. And what are they doing? They're making breakfast. Okay? What's the child doing? He's sleeping. Light doesn't jive well. So he's sleeping. He or she is sleeping. It's mostly boys, but also girls are impacted by this. And he's sleeping in the room he grew up in. Okay? So the parents go off to work, and he sleeps the whole day. At dusk, what happens? The parents come back. They return from work, and what are they doing? They're making dinner. And he's in his bedroom, and he wakes up because it's nighttime now. And what the research is showing is, here's what these kids do. So they're in their bedroom, and they're smoking pot, they're eating. Obesity is very high in this population. They're looking at porn, they're gaming, and they're doing online gambling. Okay? And they will do that all night long when the parents are doing what? Sleeping. And then in the morning, what happens? The kid retires, he goes to sleep, the parents wake up. This is such a rising demographic. I get calls every week, and there's not been enough research to really tell how to therapeutically intervene. UCLA is developing a van program where they go out to these houses and start to do interventions in the home because the kid can't actually leave the home. Okay? The other thing that we know about these kids, this is kind of enabling times 100. There's no conflict in these families, meaning the parents have kind of given up confronting the child. And it almost goes the other way. The parents will do the kid's laundry, will actually make meals for the kid. And some families I've seen, they will deliver the meals like under the door. It's kind of like being on a yacht. Like you get special delivery. So of course there's no motivation for that child to leave this. Okay? Now, I'm saying all this because here's my sense of what's going on. Okay? I really think what the change I have noticed is the child's capacity to engage in, tolerate, and utilize experience to support the formation of one's identity in any meaningful way seems to be limited in our culture. It's not all kids, but over the years I've seen this kind of problem where kids are not somehow utilizing and learning from experience. Self-awareness is, I've noticed in my practice, is becoming harder and harder for me to cultivate in the work I do with kids. There's something about seeing themselves, talking about their experience, learning about who they are, that is gone awry in our culture. Erik Erikson was a very famous psychologist who studied development, who I actually got a chance to study with before he died. He talked about identity diffusion. Identity diffusion was basically when an adolescent is trying to grow up and find an identity and they can't locate who they are, so they're kind of like lacking an identity. Okay? That was the major problem he kind of theorized about. What I'm actually seeing is it's almost a greater problem, which is a lot of the children and young adults I work with, they kind of don't have a process for learning about who they really are. It's kind of like there's a vacuum between their experience and learning about who they are and their own identity. Okay? Now, I want to show you this clip, this brief little transcript. I work a lot with families, I work a lot with parents and adolescents. Here is a little snippet of what I think is going on to promote this kind of issue. So this is a teenage daughter, and here's what she's saying to her mother, okay? She says, "I don't have confidence in myself. You didn't know that, did you? I have the worst fucking confidence of anyone I know. I can't stand myself sometimes. I think people are staring at me. I don't like my body. I think my grades are mostly due to all the tutoring and not my real intelligence." Okay? So she's obviously has a lot of self-esteem issues and doubts herself. The mother says this, "That's not good, honey. You should have confidence. You're not thinking right. You have so much. And the daughter comes back, so typical. What do you make of this interaction? Say it again. Who does? The mother? Yeah.
The parents don't know what to do.
The parents don't know what to do. This is not a bad mother. She's actually quite well-intentioned, right? Is she anxious? The mother. Yeah. Hearing her baby girl reckon with herself in this way makes the mother's anxiety surge, okay? So she does this kind of response, which by the response of the daughter, so typical, the daughter's basically checked out. She's heard this, they've been around this 1,000 times, and the daughter's basically not being heard, okay? And what I'm saying is, this is one small example in this daughter's life of an experience in her family, but it could be at a school with her peers, it could be anywhere, where her experience is not being validated, it's certainly not being explored, and she certainly can't kind of learn from it, right? Like if you think of all the elements that need to happen, learning, tolerating it, then trying to understand it, and then trying to figure out what it means for her as a person, her identity, that whole process just gets stopped inadvertently by a well-intentioned mother. Does it make sense? Now, what I try to do in a lot of my work, and this is very different than when I started my practice, what I try to emphasize with parents, with other people I work with who are involved with kids, is we need really to help children see that we see and understand their experience of themselves. Okay? Meaning, children need to find an identity. They need to have somebody help them reflect upon their experience. It's so basic. And I talk about this often with the metaphor of helping kids begin to see themselves as they're a character in a movie of their life. If you think about that, that's the beginning of what we could call self-insight, right? Or like learning, where you begin to see how you are in certain situations, your narrative, and somebody is there interacting with you to reflect that, to notice it, and to give you a sense of what the narrative is. So you start to think about yourself as an entity going through life. This is lacking, okay? And Nietzsche, the German philosopher, talked about this. He actually talked about his view of mental health was known as amorphity. Amorphity in Latin means to love one's fate. And what he meant by that was when we're on our deathbed, we need to basically look back on our life and kind of like see it all as making sense, right? Like the mistakes we made, the joy we had, the decisions that set us up for success or failure. All of it has to kind of come together in like a state of acceptance and understanding, okay? That's what he meant by amorphity, where we see our life as a whole and we understand it and kind of connect with it. This is lacking right now. And I would say that, at least in the work I do with kids, there's kind of 3 elements to this. And I always like to use the Wedding Crashers movie to point out this first element. You've seen the Wedding Crashers movie, okay? So it's basically, you know, two 40-year-old guys who are going to weddings to meet girls and sleep with them, okay? Ironically, of course, during this, one of them falls in love, and that catapults him to kind of growing up and becoming an adult. This, in our culture right now, the movement toward separation and individuation is becoming more and more blurred and delayed, okay? And I really think that part of what's going on is, like the driving example, is one little tidbit of kids even early on wanting to bypass normal experiences to grow up and move on, okay? The other thing that's happening, I alluded to this earlier, is that the bandwidth for emotional experience is narrowing, okay? So what I do a lot in my work with adolescents, I see a lot of adolescents, and what do they want to do? They want to feel good, okay? They want to feel good, and if they feel bad, that's kind of like, it's intolerable, right? And of course, this leads to all sorts of things like coasting. I don't want to put much effort to things, or you know, avoiding challenging situations where they might fail, or of course, substance abuse. Substance abuse is a way to immediately catapult from feeling negative to feeling positive. Okay, so I work a lot with my kids on tolerating negative emotional experience. Okay? Then the last sort of component of where we are, I think, is narcissism. Now, this word gets thrown around a lot. Let me just give you my spin on it. I believe we are in a culture of narcissism. Okay? And the selfie, I think, is the one great image of this. Okay? The selfie is really not a celebration of who one is. It's basically a foil, meaning what it's blocking or what it's concealing is the fact that a lot of people out there don't feel secure. They don't know who they are, and they certainly don't feel secure, and they don't feel secure about the limitations or weaknesses they have. So we are in a narcissistic culture where it's all about me, and the all about me really conceals a lot of insecurity, okay? And what's really interesting about this is the research is showing that we are going to basically organize a lot of our groups, meaning family groups, work groups, around narcissism, okay? Which basically means there's going to be a narcissistic figure and a lot of codependent people linked to the narcissist, okay? This is how a lot of companies work. There's a narcissist who demands and who has no vulnerability, surrounded by codependents who have profound weaknesses and limitations and live to serve the narcissist. The Human Magnet Syndrome is a great book. If you have not read this, I think everybody should read this. It's written by Ross Rosenberg. It came out a couple years ago, where he basically profiled a very common structure in couples, which is, it's a magnetic attraction. The one person is a narcissist, and the other person's a codependent, and they link together, okay? And this is, what I'm saying is this is becoming universal. We're now structuring groups of all kinds around narcissistic codependent combinations. Make sense? I'm going to get to hope in a minute. Are there any questions yet? You okay? Is some of this ringing true?
Depressed.
Okay. Now, you should be familiar with the work of Daniel Siegel. Okay? So we're going to start to move toward what do we do about the predicament we're in. Daniel Siegel is a psychiatrist up at UCLA, and he's established a new field called interpersonal neurobiology. Okay, so he's a pioneering scientist. And essentially, what he's developed is a field that connects brain, mind, and relationships. Okay? He's got many, many books that are all very good. And I can send you these slides if you want them. There's a lot here for parents. The one that I like the most is Parenting from the Inside Out. This is a book about how parents, of course, learn about their own traumas with their own parents through the act of parenting their own kids. Okay? And essentially, here's what Siegel has discovered, which gives us a lot of hope. If you remember your basic high school biology class, this is a neuron. Do you remember that? No? Okay. So the neuron is connected by axons and dendrites, okay? This is brain density, okay? So Siegel's very interested in how brains develop. And look at, in 15 months, you see the brain density. This is what we want. In a healthy brain, healthy development, we want to build a lot of neuron density in the brain, okay? And this is Siegel's main point. The midbrain, which is this area right here, the midbrain contains the amygdala and the hippocampus and some other structures. That's the midbrain or the feeling center of the brain. That in our evolution is earlier than the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, this area, evolved much later in human development. Now, what area of the brain do you think is better developed in adolescence? The feeling center or the thinking center, or the prefrontal cortex? The feeling center, okay? As it turns out, the prefrontal cortex is not fully loaded with the density that it really needs until mid-30s. There's actually new evidence that says it might even go into the early 40s. So brain density is still building in this area. Adolescence, this is pretty much well developed. That's why, of course, adolescents are really good at emotions, and then what to do with the emotions is lacking. Okay, that's no surprise. Okay? And what's also interesting about Siegel's work is his whole view is, in order to grow a brain, we need relational experience that is purposeful. And here's what I mean. His view is this brain needs somebody to engage with to activate the feeling center of the brain and the thinking center of the brain. Does this make sense? So his view is to build neuron density, you have to kind of work out these areas. It's like muscle tissue. It needs to be worked out to build up. So this brain can't develop in isolation, which of course is very interesting if you think about just texting. Texting is kind of like, it's a form of isolation. So Siegel's view is this brain needs to interact with somebody who can activate the emotion center of the brain and then activate the thinking center of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And by doing that, connect them. Meaning, a person who is psychologically stable and autonomous can have feelings and then think about their feelings. Okay? It's actually a very elegant way to look at just at maturity. Maturity is somebody who can feel and then think about the feelings. And that's the bridging between these two. Thinking about the feelings, meaning you can make decisions, you can learn from, you can do all that. So that was Siegel's view. And what's interesting is his other idea is pruning. Pruning is like the garden, meaning if this brain isn't engaged with somebody else to activate neurons in these areas, those areas will start to deteriorate and die away. Okay? So for example, like in a profoundly abusive environment where it's hyper aware of just being abused, this, of course, this whole prefrontal cortex is shut down, and the emotion center of the brain is only activated to avoid or escape. So that is profoundly limiting of the growth of the brain. Okay? And some researchers think under severe circumstances, a young adult's brain that has experienced a lot of pruning can look a lot like NFL football players' brains that are like lesioned out from chronic trauma. Okay? Fun stuff? Now, there is hope, I promise. 20 years ago, if you went to a parenting workshop, here's what you would have been told. You would have been told, this is your adolescent's brain, okay? This area of the brain is not developed. This is the midbrain, that's very well developed. This area of the brain is not well developed, meaning your child can't really anticipate consequences. They can't learn from their mistakes. They can't organize. All the things that we get on them for not being able to do, the idea was they can't do it because their brains are not ready to do it yet. So parents were told 20 years ago, you must be your kid's frontal lobe. Right? So if your kid can't think about handing in his homework, and if he doesn't, he won't get into college, you must do that for them. Now, of course, what happened is parents listened to this and they did it very, very well. So they became their kids' frontal lobes, meaning that's the helicopter parent. Okay? So what we're now learning about this is that is very problematic, because essentially what's happening is you're putting this part of the brain on training wheels. That's why I have this picture here. Meaning that the frontal lobe is never getting a chance to work out and develop and build strength and neuron density. Okay? So, to just go all the way back around, what we need to do, and this is kind of my sense of where we need to go in our culture, we need to help our kids by helping build their brains. Meaning, we need to find a way to activate, explore their emotion center of the brain, the midbrain, and then help, however we can, to help them start to think about their feelings. Does that make sense? And in some ways, that's the kind of self-experience that it's kind of like what I try to do in psychotherapy. Basically, what I'm trying to do when I sit down with a kid is a lot of kids, they never have anybody relate to their feelings, you know what I'm saying? Just to help them explore and kind of vent feelings. I mean, think of that mother that you saw with that girl, right? So a lot of kids just want to work out their emotion center of the brain in psychotherapy. And then all I do is try to help them start to think about their feelings. By that I mean I'm trying to get them to start to think about who they are and what the movie of their life is. So they start to have a sense of, I am a self and identity going through the world and facing challenges. Now, this, of course, is the whole mindfulness movement that's entering a lot of school districts. That's essentially what they're trying to do. It's kind of another way of getting at the same thing. They're trying to help kids, instead of just acting out on their emotions, to sit and tolerate their emotional experience and then to think about it. It's the same idea. I'm going to end on this. There's a really interesting book. Some of you who are interested in psychology might like this book. It's called Modes of Therapeutic Action. It's by Martha Stark. She's a psychologist and a Harvard professor in Boston. She has written a book that kind of looks at 4 levels of interpersonal development that I am now using with kids in my practice. So let me tell you what she kind of has theorized about. She talks about 4 kind of breakdowns in the relational capacities of people, and you could think of kids and fit them into these buckets. I mean, I do this with my practice all the time. The first level is accessibility. That's what she calls it. Meaning, these are the non-relational kids. And these are the kids who often will go to Facebook and gaming. Can't relate. They're not part of groups in their high school. They don't have activity. So they're isolated and home alone. Okay? And we call them schizoid kids, meaning they almost cannot be related to. They don't understand what relationships are really about. Second level of kid, these are kids, but Martha Stark's framework for relational functioning is accountability. She calls this noxious relatedness. Okay? This is the narcissistic, entitled kid that some of you might know. Okay? This is where it's kind of like, it's all you and I'm good. So this is a whole, I spend hours each week working with kids on building this capacity. It's like unbelievable, where they're telling me about scenarios where they almost have no ability to take accountability. It's unbelievable. So what I'm trying to do is help them think about their experience and begin to parcel out, what Dad did and what your part of the issue was. The third level that Martha Stark talks about is acceptance, or what she calls narcissistic relatedness. This, of course, has to do with what I was saying earlier. This is a problem among many kids who they essentially are highly insecure, and they can't talk about or experience their vulnerability. And the movie I always suggest to watch this is A River Runs Through It. I don't know if some of you have seen this movie. This is a must-see movie. It's about 2 sons who grew up with a Methodist father, and Brad Pitt plays one of the sons. And in the film, Brad Pitt is a narcissistic child, and you'll get a good sense of that. And then the last level that Martha Stark talks about is awareness, or neurotic relatedness. These are the kinds of kids I see. They're the type A. They've got to go to Harvard or Princeton. They're doing 100 things. They're always upset. They're almost having too much anxiety about who they are as people. So I spend a lot of time with these kids. So in short, there is hope. I think we're in a confluence of factors are blurring and delaying kids' growth into young adulthood. And there's a lot of challenges, but one of the answers, if you kind of take the takeaway of all this, is that the relational experience that we can provide for kids can really help their brains grow, literally help their brains grow, and then help them achieve these kinds of levels of relatedness in the world that can help them be, productive people, and also to have intimacy. I mean, if you think about this, these are all factors that could really obstruct one's capacity for intimacy. So I hope that makes sense. Questions?
Yes. So the frontal lobe surrogacy.
The what?
The frontal lobe
Yes.
surrogacy part.
Yeah.
So clearly, kids that are really young, right, our 3-4-year-olds, we're thinking for them, because that makes sense. And clearly, on the other end, if you're the frontal lobe for your 22-year-old, there's a problem. But where is that point in the middle where you pull back? Like, when is that transition where you clearly that conversation we have with them. When do we let our kids go? And when do we pull back and let them?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. What I would say is, I mean, if you think about, it's interesting. I do a parenting group. I can give you a flyer about this. I meet with parents once a month now. We've just started meeting where we talk about this very issue. The idea being, what is the graded and sequential way that we can move from being the kid's frontal lobe and then slowly, gradually backing off so that the different parts of their brain grows. The long and short of it is that there's no clear answer. So what I try to do with the parents I work with is I kind of compare it to going to the gym, right? Like every experience is a potential little workout for your child, where instead of kind of going in and disciplining them, which might be your sort of first reaction, you can try to start out with a 1-pound weight. Like, what were you thinking when you bit your brother? That kind of thing, right? So you're if you have this model in mind, you're thinking every opportunity with my kid is a chance to fire neurons, right? Either in the emotion center and or the thinking center, right? And it's kind of like you'll know when you hit the sweet spot and they can do a little bit, and then when it's too overwhelming, of course, they'll fall apart or something, and then to back off. But it's kind of like there's no clear answer other than you're at least trying. So it's the idea of like you're always trying to promote a little more growth and development and not over exert them, and of course not under challenge them. Does that make sense?
So what is it like? You're having dinner with your kid and you're trying to ask them about their day and get them to think about it, and they're just like, "It's fine, Mom. My best thing was I came home from school." Or, I mean, I don't know. Like, who did you eat lunch with? No one. I mean,
People have ideas.
I don't know. Like, how was your day? Fine. Well, what was your most favorite thing you did today? Or what did you learn in chemistry? I don't know.
Well, one view of it is you're trying too hard. Okay? But the other view is sort of like, I know it feels like you're kind of stuck, but you can then try something different. For example, how was the day? Fine.
I did. I tried it. Like, what was your favorite?
When you say fine,
Yeah. Okay.
I wonder if that's really what you mean. You see what I'm doing? I mean, it might not work, but I remember when you said fine last month and you were sitting on top of a really big problem. Is that where we are again? What I'm trying to do by that is I'm saying, here's kind of how I understand you. So I'm trying to push them. I'm saying I kind of get how you work, and by doing that, even if your child doesn't react well, they'll at least know you're trying to understand them. That's the point.
Like today, I tried saying, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from because you're mad because I took away your phone because you didn't do your homework. And all you do is come home from school and watch YouTube all day, and you break from it. Because YouTube is like our generation's television.
Right.
And they would say you only should let your kid watch an hour of TV
Right.
a day, but they have their phone all the time. They're just watching YouTube all the time.
Okay.
So then he's very mad, and I'm like, well, help me understand why you're so mad that I can't have you go do your homework.
Okay.
And there's like no answer.
Well, what happened when you asked that?
Just like mad face and not
Okay.
just like not talking at all.
Okay. And then what happened?
He threw something and slammed the door. I don't know. I just don't know what to do.
Well, I mean, maybe slamming the door wasn't great, but I'm thinking, you got this fired. And so what I always talk about with parents is, we could talk about these situations for hours, but I always talk about the term strike while the iron is cold. So there was an outburst and you got this. Oh, I actually think it went fairly well. And what I always say is maybe the next day there will be a little moment where things are kind of calm and you can say, what was going on for you last night? You see, that little question is that's like getting over here. And it might not work the first 5,000 times you try it. But literally, the 5,000th and first time, you might get a little bit. But let me just say this, because it's really, all your child really wants to see is that you're trying. You know what I'm saying? Meaning, if you're not concerned with their growth, they will know it. Meaning, your own anxiety is getting in the way. You're kind of parenting for yourself. So when you do that, your kid is going to lose credibility in you because they know you're after your own anxiety, not something else. So once you get out of that and they see you really trying to do this kind of work, even if it doesn't result instantly in things that you're looking for, they believe in what you're doing. You're trying to understand them.
I think he just wants me to leave him alone.
And you could ask him that. You can say, I get the sense you want me to leave you. That's you going over here. That's like, he's like, then he might go, yeah, I kind of do. That's like the little movie thing. He's starting to see himself. See, when you say that and he goes, shit, I think I do, that's a little moment of self-reflection. You see? If you have 100,000 of them, by the time he's 25, he'll be ready to live a life.
I tried that.
Yeah, but like I said, if you don't leave them alone, you'll have a vampire child. So. Yeah.
I have an issue with leaving the child alone. That the parents supposed to do. So if the child is misbehaving in your view, and then you say leave them alone, that's like withdrawing. That's like giving up. I understand it's a teenager. I grew up where I had to show respect to her. So that could be
Yes.
that. It could be angry.
Yes.
But I could
Okay.
not be rude.
Okay.
So maybe it's my personal thing, but leaving alone to me.
Okay.
Let me just say this, because this is not always true, but often. Well, the assumption you're starting out with is your child wants to grow up and separate from you and fly the nest, right? And what's also going on? They're what? They want to stay a child. Okay? Meaning, a part of them wants to grow up and develop and leave, and a part of them is very frightened of doing that, usually unconsciously. So they want to stay very young. Okay? So, a large percentage of time when your child acts out or disobeys, and they're demanding a response from you, what is that? Huh? They want to stay a child. So what I'm saying is it looks like they're rebelling and they're challenging you, right? But what they really want you to do is parent them. Right, so what I'm saying is, if the child is going to do a lot of things to activate you to be parental, and you keep responding in a way that's parental, what are you inadvertently doing? You're keeping them young. You're doing the first step of a vampire child. You're creating a vampire child. Okay? So what you're doing is, I'm not saying don't ever discipline your child. What I'm saying is, you have to start to determine when your child is acting out to get parenting. And you're going to continue to parent them and discipline them, but you're going to start to see when they're doing this little trick. It's a little, like it's an unconscious game. I have a case where this is a mature kid. This is what he does. He's growing up. He's doing very well. He can now drive. He's got a girlfriend. Okay? And his parents are starting to let him go out with the car by himself. And he's now, for the first time, disobeying them by violating the curfew. They say 10 p.m., it's 10:30. They say 9, it's 9:30. Why is he doing that? Huh? It's not testing. What? It's he is ambivalent about growing up. You getting this? So when he goes out and violates the curfew, it looks like he's challenging their authority, but what he really wants when he comes through the door is what? What does he want mom and dad to do for the next 3 hours? He wants to get a big talking to, right? Get there, all this drama. So what's soothing about that is my mom and dad are there, hovering over me. You getting what I'm saying? And the girlfriend and driving and college and sex and all that, I'm now protected from. You get what I'm saying? So in a large number of situations, probably more than you anticipate, this is what's going on. It's pushing to get parenting. And eventually what needs to happen is you don't withdraw, but you stop the reactivity. So for example, in the therapy session the other day, the parents said, they're basically saying, why are you doing this? Because the more and more that you do this, the more and more we're going to take things away. And the kid finally said, I want you to take things away. It was so interesting. Meaning, you hear what I'm saying? He doesn't want the car. He doesn't want to see the girlfriend at night. It's too much. He wants to stay at home with mom and dad. You see?
So what do you suggest? Yeah.
So what I suggest is the parents, once the kid can start to talk about how he feels, it's like, that was a huge breakthrough. Now now the kid's like, God, I can't play this game anymore with the car and the curfew, because now it's like the cat's out of the hat. You see what I'm saying? So now he can come and talk to a therapist about his fear of maturing and growing up. It's not about his mom and dad. His mom and dad are like, go. And he's holding on.
So in that situation, right, do we not have a consequence, or do we have consequences and just don't make a big drama about it?
You have consequences 2 days later. That's the way I often do it. So it's like, it's the parents are getting out of the pull of responding to the kid's need to remain childlike. That's the whole point.
So what happened at the end?
Well, that was just the other day. You're updated. I don't know. Here's another example of this. This is just, I'm just giving, because it's a lot of kids when they come in with their parents, right? So it's Billy, mom and dad. Billy comes in, and what's the first thing he will do to end the session? He doesn't want to be there. Well, he gets up. He'll often curse. So he'll curse. And what do mom and dad do? Yeah. What kind of, they start to so I tell, it's usually the dad, I say, stop. So now the kid curses, the curse hovers over the office, nothing happens, and now it's kind of like, it literally, it's not, I know it's not this easy, but in some cases, I just end it cursing. Because now the kid is like, oh shit, they're not gonna, I want parenting. What do I gotta do now to get parenting? And once I get the parents out of that, it's like all that's left is for the kid to talk about how they feel. So parents get caught up in this over and over again.
My kids are getting ready to go to college.
Yes.
There's a lot of stress about applying for colleges. They've heard it from me. And I think it's good for them to leave the nest, to get out and do some growing up. And they've heard that throughout their life. Hey, this is the way it's going to be. So they kind of know what's expected of them. Now, maybe that's not good for all kids. I guess what's a healthy thing to stress to your kids? You want them to leave the nest. What's healthy? What should you be doing?
Well, about what part of it?
Getting them out.
Okay. Well, your situation is better than most. They're already headed out, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of your work is done.
What if they don't want to go?
We don't want to step back anymore. How about that?
Well, that's. I mean, I'm a proponent of them leaving, right? So if it's not college, it should be a job. It should be like they should go live somewhere else. They should work. They should. So if they're not wanting to do that, when I hear that, I get like all this stuff that I presented is starting to happen. So it's like it's going to be a bit of a challenge to get them out. So psychotherapy is, an option, or of course just trying to talk with them about what they're feeling about leaving. I mean, even that is worth doing because of you'll help them talk about their feelings and how they think about their feelings. I mean, does that make sense? It's having a dialogue with them, not just like enforcing things on them.
So wait, I want to go back to you waited 2 days then to punish him or to deal with
About the
the curfew. What do you say at that time in day 2? Are you saying, so that night you came back late, why did you know what the curfew was, right? Why did you disregard it?
And now,
Okay. What I do in the parenting group is if you just say why, they're going to go, I don't know. So you have to start to, it's hard to explain this, but you have to start to give them a kind of narrative about what you think is going on that they can think about. So even if you said something like, you know, you're such a great kid, and you're not obeying the curfew, I'm assuming there's probably a good reason why you're not. You see, even that's different than, why are you not obeying the curfew? So just that is like, I mean, that's what in some ways I'm saying you have to be like a mini psychologist. That's what psychologists do all day long. And you're kind of doing it for 2 minutes when you get the chance to. So it's just a little bit like that is elevating the kind of dialogue you're having with your kid. You're asking them to do more than just respond to you coming at them. Does that make sense? So even if you said, you know, something and they were like, no, that's ridiculous, at least they're thinking about themselves and they know you're thinking about them. That's the point. Rather than, see, it's so different than going, you disobeyed us again. We're taking away the car. See, that there's nowhere else to go with that. Then they just go, okay.
Yeah. So you're not supposed to make judgments. You're just supposed to wait and
That's right.
just wait and see what they should. Okay.
Just curious. So for the case you talk about, then what happened? If the case wrong or something, the case.
The what case?
Just the case you talk about.
Yeah.
So what happened to the case and between the relationship between the kid and the parents? So
Well, I just had that session this week. Yeah, so it's like I can come back next month and tell you. But what I'm assuming is, what I said earlier is now the kid's anxiety is out. So the whole dynamic now is shifted. You see, he's violating the curfew not because he's being rebellious. He's violating it because he's insecure about growing up. So my sense is he's going to no longer violate the curfew, and he's going to be able to really start to explore his insecurities and fears about growing up. So the point is his parents are now out of it. That's the point, right? So once they're out of it, he can actually start to grow. But when the parents are in it, reflection and growth goes way down.
So for the ladies they ask about, so on the case, what's your suggestion? Should they just leave them know, or should they, when they ask?
Yeah.
She asks the
Right. What I'm saying is it's always good to do it later. So you're having kind of a discussion about their behavior later, not in the moment. That's always better.
It look like she asked any time what happened in school, and she just said fine. And then what are you gonna?
Okay, yeah. So that's the same kind of idea. So what I was saying is, so a lot of parents will go, just fine. You say fine, like it becomes you can say, well, you try to provide them a little more, like you make them work more. You know, when I ask you about, you say fine, I get the sense it's not fine. Last week you said something was fine and it wasn't. Is that you know, so you make them work. What I'm saying, it doesn't always work, but at times you'll see how it creates it's like a different kind of engagement with them. It's not an impasse, which is do this, think this, and the kid's like, you know. You're looking for anything else to deviate out of that.
Just quickly, the girl who said that she lacked confidence, what should the mom have said?
Did I pass it?
Yeah, you just there.
If you had a PET scan of this kid's brain, this part, the kid's brain is lighting up. You with me? Yeah. Meaning, like their midbrain, their feeling center is firing, it's lit up. And probably part of their prefrontal cortex is lighting up. Right? They say all this, it's kind of like they want a workout. They want to engage. This stops. Once this response comes in, the kid's brain on a PET scan would just go neutral. It would just stop. I mean, literally, that's what happens. She says, so typical, and it's like deadening. It's like, we're done. So, here's what could be said. Wow. So you don't like your body and you're not smart and kids look at you. That's what I would say. Now, if you saw a PET scan, that I'm basically taking the heat of what she's saying and I'm just kind of folding it back. I'm saying, okay, a lot of heat here, but I'm up for it. Here it is. And so I reflect it back, and then what do I want her to do? I want her to keep going. Like the metaphor for here is, it's a sports metaphor, you want to keep the ball in play. The ball goes out of bounds, it's over. This is, I want to do anything to keep this going. So I just do reflective listening. She says, yeah, I'm ugly, I'm dumb, and well, take today what Susan said to me. Now I'm in. Now I'm like literally thinking, I've got a brain workout going on here. I'm good. So what happened with Susan? Well, she said I was really fat. Really? Yeah, but you see what I'm doing? Now I've got Samantha's, the midbrain is firing, and then as we get through the emotional heat, what am I thinking I'm going to try? Now I'm going to try to go to the prefrontal cortex. You see? I'm thinking of Siegel's model. So I've got a lot of midbrain emotion firing, and then after she kind of experiences all that and starts to cool down, or just kind of linger in it, I might say something like, the last year has been really rough for you with your friends, hasn't it? You see that? That's what I mean by the movie. That's like the amor fati thing. Now I'm saying, okay, we got all this emotion. Her brain doesn't know what to do with all that. It's just a glob of emotion. Now I've gone through it with her. Now I'm going to be like, okay, let's see how we can like organize it. So I might just say, yeah, you've had a lot of trouble with your friends this year. That's a little bit like I want her to start thinking about, so she can go, yeah, it was like that with Cindy and Karen and Jesse, but William is still on my side. Well, what about William? You see what I'm doing? Now I'm into the thinking area of her brain, the prefrontal cortex. And if it stopped there, I'd be like, that was an awesome workout. I got a lot of emotion, and I got a little prefrontal cortex, a lot of neuron firing, and I'm good. In fact, there's now data that can now look at brains when neurons are being developed. It's like science fiction-y. And when there's this kind of activity in the brain, you almost see little neurons budding, like alien stuff. They're budding to try to meet the relational experience. So if I just had that 5-minute dialogue, I'm thinking I might have got 900 new budded neurons. And I'm like, that's awesome. If she goes away and slams her door and is in her bedroom all night, I'm like, I helped build some neurons. You see what I'm doing?
So what's your suggestion on kids who spend too much time, like even becomes addicted to the electronic device and becoming social accident? Like take away the device. What's the best thing?
Every kid's different. I can't give a broad-based, but I mean, coming out of this, the one thing you want to do is try to talk to your child about it. You know, and like you want to try to add in some of this, like, you know, I get the sense this is a way that you can stay connected with friends because you're not in part of any groups at school, anything like that, so at least they reflect on it. But every case is different. Was this helpful? Yeah, the Martha Stark book. Yeah, I can share these slides with you. That's Modes of Therapeutic Action.
Is your email address on the first page?
I think it's right here. Yeah, so it's just jt@jamestobinphd.com. You can email me. I'll send you the slides. If you also want information on this parenting group that I do, there's flyers right here. And that parenting group, what we do is we try to go through these scenarios and we go through what to say, how to say it in this kind of framework. I know this was a lot, but hopefully you got something out of it. At least it can get you to think about things.
Thank you.
Thank you.